Timing for a real estate settlement can be crucial, whether you're a buyer needing a home to move into or a seller needing to sell at a particular time to be able to buy your next home. I'm Peter Boscas with Red Cedar Real Estate, and in this video in our Good, Better, Best mini-series, we'll be exploring different options for settlement dates and how this date can be tweaked to be more attractive to the seller, as well as another secret weapon buyers can use to help their offer stand out against their competition. In a normal real estate transaction in Maryland and DC, settlement usually occurs about 30 days after a real estate contract has been ratified or signed off on by the buyers and sellers. This 30-day window allows the home inspection, appraisal, lender processing, and title work to be completed at a reasonable pace. It also gives the parties enough time to work out any follow-up tasks like arranging for home repairs and for the sellers to pack and prepare their move. Sometimes this window can be longer. For instance, if a buyer is receiving a grant as part of the process, or certain lenders may require more time to process their loans. But 30 days is basically the standard expected time frame. In many circumstances, though, this date can become an important deciding factor for a seller as to whether or not to accept one offer over another. Different sellers may have different goals in mind when selling their home. For instance, if the seller's already vacated the home that's for sale and is now paying two mortgages, one on the home for sale and one on their new home, they're very likely going to want to sell as soon as possible to limit the number of days they're making double mortgage payments. However, sellers who are still looking for their next home or are having a home built that isn't quite ready yet might be looking to settle later than the 30 days after contract acceptance. This will give them more time to finalize their arrangements for their next home. This is one of the more nuanced variables buyers can tweak, so making this one as attractive as possible to sellers requires some finesse and investigation from the buyer's agent and flexibility on the part of the buyers. For instance, if a seller needs a 60-day settlement while they're waiting for their new home to be built, a buyer demanding a 30-day settlement might not be an offer the seller can accept. Having a conversation with the listing agent prior to submitting an offer can help a buyer dial in on specifically what time frame would work best for the seller. A listing agent who is proactively representing their client should also be asking the seller what their preference is for settlement timing before the house is listed for sale, so the agent can let buyers know what the seller is looking for. It's important for buyers to understand how an extended or reduced time frame could affect their ability to purchase the home or the additional fees the buyer may be unexpectedly taking on. If the settlement window is too short for the lender and the title company to complete their portion of the process, the buyers might find themselves in breach of the contract, and the seller may be able to cancel the contract if the buyer can't close in time. On the flip side, if the settlement window is too long, it might not be possible for the buyer to lock in their interest rate or could expose them to higher interest rates than they're expecting. Or if the buyer does lock their rate, but the lock is only good for 60 days, but settlement is 90 days out, the buyer might be on the hook for a significant rate lock extension fee. Buyers should discuss all of these potential issues with their lender and their agent prior to submitting an offer so they know how aggressive they can be with the settlement date while also still protecting themselves as much as possible. One of the ways to mitigate some of these issues, like the rate lock problem, would be for a buyer to offer the seller a rent back. A rent back, or what's technically called a post-settlement occupancy agreement, or post-oc, is an agreement between the buyer and seller that once settlement has occurred and the buyer now technically owns the home, the seller will be allowed to live in the house for some additional time frame. This can be a tremendous benefit to the seller, especially in a hot market. It helps the seller more conveniently time the settlement of their current home and the next home that they're buying. Without this type of agreement, the seller may need to settle on both homes on the same day, which means packing up a moving truck in the morning and unloading that same truck at night. With the extra time afforded by the rent back, the seller can settle on their current home and then use the extra time in their home to finish packing and move into the new home at a more reasonable pace. Sometimes these clauses can come in handy if the seller has school-aged children who need a little extra time to finish out the school year. Or there could be a situation where the seller has a specific date they have to be in another state for work, but is trying to time the sale of their current home with that move and didn't want to wait until it was too late to list the home. Whatever the situation, offering a rent back to a seller can be a huge bargaining chip in a competitive offer situation. This also helps alleviate the rate lock problem mentioned earlier because the settlement date would happen during the normal rate lock period, so all of those additional fees would be avoided. Again, as a buyer, your agent should be having meaningful conversations with the listing agent to see what exactly the seller is trying to accomplish with their sale. One of the questions the agent should be asking is whether the seller would benefit from a rent back, and if so, what length of additional time the seller would like to maintain possession of the home. In an equal market that doesn't favor buyers or sellers specifically, the seller would typically pay a prorated rent to the buyer for this rent back period. And usually the rent the seller pays would be based on the carrying cost of the buyer's new loan, which would include the mortgage, real estate taxes, hazard insurance, and any homeowners or condo association fees associated with the property. Essentially, the seller is paying the buyer's cost of owning the home during this period, so the buyer isn't out any money while the seller is still on the home. As enticing as this rent back is for the seller, there are ways to make it even more attractive if the buyer is trying to be as aggressive as possible in a competitive offer situation. One of the ways to do this is to offer the rent back to the seller at no cost, or basically free housing for that period of time. This means the buyer won't be compensated for the time the seller remains in the home after settlement, so it could be the equivalent of offering the seller a couple $1,000s more in their pocket as an inducement to accept your offer over someone else's. One thing to keep in mind is that the buyer's new mortgage payment will skip the first month after settlement. So for instance, if a buyer settles on a home in January, the first payment typically wouldn't be due until March 1st. So if the seller was asking for a 30-day rent back, the buyer could offer that without paying a mortgage and rent at the same time. At the end of the day, a careful and thoughtful collaboration between the buyer, lender, and agent can craft a very compelling settlement situation that can really set their offer apart from the competition. And communication from a good listing agent can help guide buyers to offer the perfect settlement solution the seller's looking for. In this series, we've explained the most common variables in the home offering process and how buyers can tweak each one to be as competitive as possible, as well as how sellers can evaluate each one of these options when presented with offers. In our next video, we'll discuss why real estate transactions fall apart and how sellers and buyers can best prepare for these issues to avoid complications and expensive mistakes. If you'd like to learn more, make sure you like and subscribe and turn on notifications so you can be alerted as soon as our next video is published.